From the studios of Farm Journal Broadcast, this is U.S. Farm Report.
Welcome to U.S. Farm Report this weekend. I'm Tyne Morgan. It was the first operational land-grant university established in 1863. And 161 years later, the sprawling campus in Manhattan spans over 2,300 acres, even featuring farm fields bursting with research. And as Kansas State University works to crush the Cowboys this weekend, it's our home for the College Road Show. Tackling one of the greatest and most dire challenges for farmers and livestock producers in western Kansas.
The Ogallala High Plains is severely depleted, so we know if we don't change our actions in the next 50 years, it'll be 70% depleted.
Is history on repeat when it comes to farmland values across the U.S.?
We're really looking a lot like we did back in 2014 to 2015, where we had lower commodity prices.
But there's one major difference that could be rewriting the playbook for farmland prices in the months ahead. Meanwhile, cattle prices have made history, so how long can it last? And what's the spillover effect on demand? We're covering it all from K-State this weekend.
The 2024 U.S. Farm Report College Roadshow from Kansas State University is brought to you exclusively by Beck's. From farmers' first pass in the field to the final one at harvest, it's a game plan rooted in faith and belief. Beck's Hybrids is with you every turn because both on and off the field, we're all farmers at heart. See why at beckshybrids.com.
Now for the news. After announcing thousands of job cuts and a plan to move some production to Mexico, John Deere is facing pushback from former President Trump. Mr. Trump threatening to impose a 200% tariff on John Deere products if the company moves forward with its plans to relocate some production south of the border. The former president making the announcement while on the campaign trail during a policy roundtable in Smithton, Pennsylvania. In June, as we first reported, Deere announced it would move production of some models of small and medium-sized construction loaders to its plant in Mexico from Dubuque, Iowa. Deere in 2022 also decided to move production of cabs for large farm tractors to Mexico from Waterloo, Iowa.
I'm just notifying John Deere right now, if you do that, we're putting a 200% tariff on everything that you want to sell into the United States, so that if I win, John Deere is going to be paying a 200%. They haven't started it yet. Maybe they haven't even made the final decision yet, but I think they have. John Deere is going to, and anybody else that does this, because it's hurting our farmers, it's hurting our manufacturing.
Farm Journal Washington analyst Jim Wiesmeyer says the current U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which was signed by President Trump in 2020, maintains duty-free trade between U.S. and Mexico for most goods, allowing companies to manufacture in Mexico and export back to the U.S. without tariffs. Well, Congress reached an agreement this week on a plan to keep the government funded through almost the end of the year. Both the House and the Senate voted this week on a 3-month continuing resolution. It pushes the government's shutdown deadline from September 30th to December 20th. House Speaker Mike Johnson and fellow Republicans needed votes from the Democratic colleagues to get the CR approved. But Johnson has warned that when this new extension expires, he will not support a massive catch-all bill to fund the government, referred to as an omnibus. So another stopgap may be needed that would allow the new president and Congress to have the final say on fiscal year 2025 spending levels. Well, drier weather has sped up harvest in places, but areas of the Midwest have recently seen some rains. Late last week, we checked on harvest in central Illinois with 2 growers. Many in the area have started harvesting early season corn planted in April. When it comes to soybeans, well, there is concern that later planted beans may have lost some yields in that drier conditions that we saw late summer. Farmers actively watching bean moisture levels right now.
You don't want beans to go under like 13.5% moisture because you don't get that yield back. So they're trying to get them there, but with this dry weather, beans have dropped drastically in the last 5 days. So growers are harvesting in the morning, and then when they get too dry in the afternoon, they're quitting.
That's it for the news. Well, 96% of Kansas is covered in dryness and drought, but parts of the south and eastern Corn Belt brace for the impacts of the hurricane this week. We'll have a check of your forecasts coming up next.
U.S. Farm Report weather is brought to you by H&S Manufacturing. Their Hydra Push manure spreaders qualify for financing starting at 2.99% through September. Contact your local H&S dealer today.
Well, we're watching the remnants of the hurricane this weekend, seeing who gets rain, but farmers here in Kansas could not buy a rain this summer. Just 3 months ago, 55% of the state was seeing dryness or drought. Today, it's 96%. Jack Van Meter joining us now with the latest look at that drought monitor and the longer-term forecast. Jack?
Taking a look at our estimated rainfall for the next week, we can see it's actually going to be fairly skewed. Why is that? Well, we have Helene to take a look at. This large mass of just tropical air and especially moisture is just going to absolutely deposit a lot of moisture, especially in the southern Midwest and actually parts of the Great Lakes region as well. As we can see, especially down here, that's where that low pressure system is really going to stall out and again just squeeze out any available moisture as well. And also we can tell that it's kind of the tale of two parts of the country. It's kind of playing the game of where's the high pressure at? Well, it's definitely going to be in the plains and out west because almost no precipitation whatsoever will be accumulated anywhere pretty much west of the Mississippi as well. East, as we can see, Helene will stall out here pretty much right around Tennessee and Kentucky and kind of track eastward where it's just going to, again, dump a lot of rain. We're talking 1 to 2 inches as well. New drought monitor that recently came out. We can take a look at some of the changes that we're seeing. And again, and it's not really looking all that great for areas of West Virginia and into Ohio. Again, still dealing with unbelievably dry conditions of extreme and even exceptional drought as well. And as we can see, that is unfortunately leaching down into southern Indiana too. Going out west, we can see the fact that, again, much of the west coast still going to be fairly dry in West Texas too. Take a look at that, dealing with the extreme and also exceptional droughts as well. And especially for the western part of the country, doesn't look like it's going to be getting any sort of help, if you will, whatsoever. Did want to take a look at our precipitation outlook for the rest of fall, and actually what we're starting to see develop is a La Nina pattern. Actually, we're switching out from La Nina earlier today, and what that means is we're going to be seeing above average precipitation, especially for the Great Lakes states and parts of the Midwest. Great news, actually, just because, again, you got to think of it, Ohio and again West Virginia pretty dry, going to be seeing above average amounts of moisture moving in via some of those troughs coming off from Canada. Flip side though, the south, especially bordering the Gulf of Mexico, going to be fairly dry as well. And as we can see, temperature outlook is going to pretty much mirror that almost exactly, with above average temperatures down south. Equal chances pretty much for much of the country. Then the Pacific Northwest actually going to be just a little cooler than average. Everything's being driven by the jet stream. As I put this in motion, we can see Helene is out of here, goes to the east coast, but we do have a trough starting to dig down from Canada, going to be bringing cooler temperatures, but more importantly, more chances of precipitation into this week as well. And as we can see, jet stream really starting to go down as well. As we can see, again, just going to be pretty high pressure down in Texas, and where we're not going to be seeing any sort of precipitation over there whatsoever.
Thanks, Jack. Well, historic cattle prices have been the bright spot for cow-calf producers, but are those high prices causing consumers to take a detour to other cuts of meat and actually impacting demand? Well, this week's marketing discussion is from right here at K-State University. It happens right after the break. Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report, Beck's College Roadshow this weekend from right here in Manhattan. A lot to discuss with the grain markets as well as livestock and even interest rates. Daniel O'Brien, Brian Brigham, as well as Glenn Tons are joining us for that discussion. All right, Daniel, I want to start with you because we had some impressive action in the grain markets to start the week, specifically with soybeans up double digits. I mean, when you look at it, was it concern about South America, or is it concern about some of these soybean yields because of this hot and dry weather that came in late?
Really a combination of both. There are concerns in the market about the planting of the South American soybean crop. And of course, that's a long-term concern. It sort of adds 10, 15 cents. That really doesn't come to fruition in a big way until we get into November, December, January, February. But as a start, it's brought concerns. And we have concerns about hot weather that's come about. Overall, I think you sum up the grain markets and say that we have large crops this year. It's just a matter of how large. These next couple of crop reports from the USDA will tell the story. There's a positive note out of all this in that generally the best cure for low grain prices is low grain prices. So we have seen some pretty good usage for livestock feed and exports, and both affected by both what Glenn and Brian are talking about. So I think for our farming audience, the kids out there, their parents are wondering about, do I store the grain or not? So probably a fair number of them will get past harvest lows, but then these other issues as they play out will depend on will impact the profitability of those storage actions.
Brian, farmers did see some relief when it comes to interest rates. The Fed making a pretty aggressive cut. I mean, it was well advertised that we were going to see a cut. How aggressive that they were with that first cut, did that surprise you?
It surprised me, and it took the market off guard as well. As you saw, the stock market shot up as soon as they made that announcement. The expectation was more for a 25 basis cut, and they went 50. So the implications for us in agriculture, it'll take a little bit to work its way through the economy, but we will see eventually some relief on interest rates.
But it seemed like not everyone was in agreement when you look at that board with the Fed on making that aggressive of a cut. So when you look at future cuts and possibly what we can see, do you think they are in alignment?
We did have a dissenter in that vote, and that's one thing that works well within the Federal Reserve is that if you disagree with the vote, you're allowed to dissent. And in fact, it was Michelle Bowman, a Federal Reserve Board of Governor who is from Council Grove, Kansas, that did dissented, and her reason was because there are still signals in the economy that inflation is still there, that the labor market is still doing well. So she felt to return to normal policy, we don't need to do 50 basis points. Let's do a little bit more of a conservative approach and go 25.
Last year when we were here, we were having this conversation. When are we going to rebuild this cattle herd? How much are we going to rebuild this cattle herd? Are there any signs that it's started yet? A year later, we are still having that same debate, Glenn.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Groundhog Day. Things change a little slower in the beef cattle space. Same question, same answer at this point is no, we have not initiated herd expansion. I think we'll start January 2025 with a few less beef cows than we started 2024 with. We might start in the summer of 25 the process of slowly expanding the herd, but I really think it's going to be the summer of 2026 before we have a real, market relevant expansion effort underway.
So you think contraction is still happening? And if we do not see herd expansion all the way until the summer of 2026, what could that mean then for prices in this time?
Yeah, so the latest forecasts are about 4 pounds of beef per person less available 2 years from now. And that's consistent with 2 years from now, we're holding back more heifers, so there's less in the supply chain. If nothing else changes, that would correspond with higher cattle prices than we have today. And that is what I expect across all weight classes over the next 2 years. But an important point here is that doesn't mean record profits, because the cost of raising, maintaining the cow herd, turning that into, edible beef and so forth, the costs are up. Economy-wide inflation is connected to the discussion we just got done having. So it's important that we recognize that, yes, cattle prices and many prices in our economy are higher. Doesn't mean that profit margins are higher for everybody.
We have a lot more to talk about. We need to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with more U.S. Farm Report in just a moment. Welcome back. Well, we'll have a WASDE report coming up in October, but the big report that we're watching right now, Daniel, is this grain stocks report coming up on September 30th. And that typically can be a big market mover, and it can have a few wild cards and throw you by surprise. So as you look at what the trade is expecting coming into this next report, is the thought that we're going to see growing grain stocks?
Generally, yes. The pre-report trade estimates are for just a little bit higher numbers than in the past. But out of this report, what you see is, first of all, an indication of how much, pretty much feed usage that we've had in the last quarter. So that'll have a lot. That'll have an impact on the WASDE supply, demand, and balance reports. But then out of this report, you get if there are any adjustments to be made to last year's grain crops, then those will show up. And really, so far, the pre-report estimates are for kind of neutrality, which means if anything happens, it'll be a surprise.
Yeah.
And that can move the market.
Well, and Daniel, that is a great point, because it is kind of looking back at the 2023 crop. And we go back to that season. We know that drought was a major player earlier in the season than it was this year. There's a lot of questions on how big of a crop did we actually have. And so we really won't know until this report on Monday, right?
It'll be the quantified hard numbers that we can go back and check and see algebraically, does it add up or not with regard to what we've used and what our supplies are. And gosh, do we need to make an adjustment? It's kind of how the USDA approaches it.
Brian, when you look at inflation right now, and we're going to talk about inflation and the impact on meat demand, but it's been hard for the Fed to tame inflation. I know you use that term sticky inflation, but what does that mean? And are there expectations that we are going to see inflation slow?
Well, we have seen inflation stick around because of, as you said, the sticky part of it, which is things like housing, insurance, those things that take longer to come down. And that has kept inflation above the Fed's target. Today, that target is about 2%, but inflation sets at about 2.75, 2.8%. So it's not quite there yet.
Consumer sentiment at the same time. I know we recently had a report come out, and, you know, we've been talking about inflation. Are consumers feeling it? Is it impacting their buying habits? But consumer sentiment, that report, what did it show recently?
Well, consumer sentiment is at an all-time low, right? We've seen it really come down to a point to where consumers are really feeling that inflation also at the grocery store, when they go to buy an automobile, even looking at home prices are quite high. So that generally will pull down the consumer sentiment. However, if you look at how we're spending our money, retail sales are up, and we still see those to continue to go. So some of that is being driven by spending down of our excess savings that we've built up in the economy, but also, too, seeing credit card debt continue to rise as well. So as a nation of consumers, we may not have that sentiment there, and eventually that will come, to kind of back off because we can only spend so much.
Okay, so as you look at consumer sentiment and you're seeing that it is at a low, is that impacting meat demand right now, Glenn?
Yes, is the short answer. So in the meat demand monitor, which is beef and pork checkoff supported, project based here at K-State, we track that sentiment. We ask the same question as the University of Michigan actually does as well. And sentiment is quite low per that. A specific number I'll share is in July, only 20% of the U.S. public said they're doing better financially than they were a year earlier. So the remaining 80% are doing the same or worse. So that weighs on, if I'm concerned about my finances, I'm going to tighten my wallet in different ways. And where it's most relevant for the meat industry is foot traffic at restaurants. So meat demand through restaurants, so think away from home consumption, is where we're seeing particularly sulfur meat demand. Retail, so grocery store for at home, has done okay, but it's the net of those two that form the domestic meat market, and we are seeing some softening in recent months.
When you look at the prices at the grocery store, are beef prices indeed higher? What about pork? What about chicken?
Yeah, so meat prices in general are higher. There's an example of chicken prices a little bit lower. Chicken supplies have grown. You wouldn't say the same about other meat proteins, but this is my earlier comment about margins is important here is, if you increase the cost in the system and demand's just flat, it can even be, a little bit up. You can still experience higher prices. If demand softens some, you can still see higher prices if cost went up enough. And just, to make this point, 25% higher cost of raising a cow compared to 4 years ago works its way through the system in the form of higher prices.
That is a good point. All right, we appreciate all of you joining us this weekend for our College Roadshow. We need to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with more U.S. Farm Report.
Hey folks, welcome back to Tractor Tales. This week we're Kansas bound for a story on a John Deere D that took some convincing for the owner to buy it.
This is a 1934 Model D John Deere. The interesting part of this tractor is I was with my father at the local John Deere dealership in the early 60s, and this tractor came in on the delivery truck, and it was in very bad shape. I didn't know what a Model D John Deere was because the neighbor had one. And so I said to my dad, man, that'd be a fun project. And my dad didn't really want to pay any attention to me. And the dealer then addressed the issue as well. He said, well, Mr. Kennedy, that'd be a fun project. He said, I'll just sell it to your son and he can work it out here in the shop after school. Now, I was a junior high at 14 years old, and I had a temporary or restricted driver's license. But for agricultural purposes, I was able to drive. So after junior high, I would drive to the dealership when I could during the following months. And the selling price of this tractor in 1965 or whatever it was $50. And so I worked out the $50. It took me about 2 months or so, working after school, assisting mechanics and working whatever needed to be done at the local John Deere dealership. I've had it since then. And I've had a lot of fun with it. Restored it a couple of different times, and I've pulled it in pulling contests, and it's always run well, and I've enjoyed it immensely over all the years.
Thanks, Greg. Well, lower commodity prices may be causing land prices to slow, but we are still seeing some eye-popping sales across the country in spite of that. But could we continue to see a correction in the farmland market? And if so, how much are we even talking? That's our Farm Journal report after the break as you rejoin us from the Little Apple.
You're watching U.S. Farm Report. Trusted, timely, tradition. The 2024 U.S. Farm Report College Roadshow from Kansas State University is brought to you exclusively by Beck's. From farmers' first pass in the field to the final one at harvest, it's a game plan rooted in faith and belief. Beck's Hybrids is with you every turn because both on and off the field, we're all farmers at heart. See why at beckshybrids.com.
Well, there's no doubt the land market is shifting under our feet, but just when you think prices are falling, some eye-popping sales catch you by surprise. Just last week, a piece of farm ground in Clinton, Iowa sold for more than $18,000 per acre. In Missouri, a parcel of ground in Ray County sold for about $17,000 per acre. But what's the story here in Kansas, especially when the cattle market is so strong? We were able to connect with a farmland expert here at K-State. Kansas farmers are dealing with a one-two punch. Not only are they coping with lower commodity prices for key crops like wheat, corn, and soybeans, but drought has also been a stubborn issue across the state. Yet farmland values have been quite resilient.
We're really looking a lot like we did back in 2014 to 2015, where we had lower commodity prices, but land values did hold fairly steady, even though farm income wasn't supporting the values that we had.
Robin Reed is an agricultural economist at Kansas State who focuses on land values.
What we've been seeing the last few years, 20% increase, 18% increase year over year in those cropland markets.
She says now there is a bit of a slowdown starting to take hold.
USDA had us about 8% increase this year over what we have been 18 to 20%, but we're still going up. And I would say that's probably going to just start slowing down, but not necessarily decreasing in the short term here.
Farmers who rely on crops may be feeling the pinch, but high cattle prices are the cash cow for cow-calf producers.
Most people connected to the cattle industry know we have very high cattle prices right now, which is good here in Kansas for our cow-calf producers. You know, it does put a little more margin squeeze on those buying stockers or buying feedlot animals. But overall, that has helped, and along with the hunting pressure that I talked about, that has really helped our pasture and rangeland prices remain strong. So I see that's the category that'll probably be more resilient than our cropland in Kansas here.
The beef industry is big business here in Kansas. The state ranks first in the number of cattle processed, second in the marketing of fed cattle in the nation, and seventh in the number of beef cows, home to approximately 1.5 million head, or 5% of the total herd in the U.S., and that makes pasture here in high demand. Reed has done extensive research on who owns land across Kansas, as well as who's buying.
When my research started in 2015, 84.5% of all of our ag ground in the state was still owned by people here in Kansas. If we fast forward 7 years, the last time I was able to look at these data, we did see an uptick, about 2.5% uptick in the amount of land that's moving out of state.
She's noticing a surge in the number of baby boomer landowners who are retiring or transitioning that land to the next generation.
There's going to be a lot of heirs that just want to sell their parcel, and so I do anticipate a lot of land being on the market. And if we don't have the farm income to support those purchases, the one thing I do see is we do have other sources of people that are willing to buy ground that'll hopefully help stabilize our ag economy and stabilize that land market.
Who owns the land and who's buying is one of the biggest questions that Reed constantly fields. But she says contrary to headlines, farmers are still the ones buying.
One thing always like to talk about is foreign ownership of agricultural ground, because that has obviously been in the news a lot the last few years.
She says with the surge in solar and wind leases across the state, it looks like more foreign investors are gobbling up farmland. But Reed says that's actually not true.
When the AFITA Act was put into place back in the 1970s, nobody thought about wind and solar leases. So I think as you look at the report, it can be a little alarming in the amount of area of our state that is foreign held. But as I dove into that data itself, it's actually a very small percentage. Less than 0.25% of all of our public ag land here in the state is foreign held at the moment.
Farmers are still in the driver's seat, but the direction of land values in the months and years ahead relies on one major factor: how long low profitability for row crop farmers persists.
If we're just in this for a couple years, we probably won't see a big effect on land values, likely more of a flattening of the market. But if we do experience this downturn for a number of years, I would expect we're going to start seeing an impact on land values and definitely cash rental rates. Those we're already hearing for next year, trying to negotiate those back down.
Reed points out the difference between the land market today and in 2014 to 2015 is interest rates. So while the situation looks similar to a decade ago, high interest rates aren't something buyers had to wade through during the last downturn and are adding another layer of difficulty today. Well, when we come back, it's a glimpse of ag around the world next. Now for a glimpse of ag around the world. Colombia will soon be getting more U.S. beef. The country recently lifting its ban on U.S. beef originating from states where avian flu was detected in dairy cattle. As U.S. Meat Export Federation President and CEO Dan Hallstrom explains, Colombia had placed a ban on beef from 13 affected states.
In April of 2024, we started experiencing some access challenges related to the H5N1 issue, and we were up to 13 states that were not allowed to export to Colombia. So what has happened is that we were averaging about $3 million a month in exports, and once we got through April and into these restrictions, we're down to less than $1 million a month. So obviously a very adverse impact there.
Hallstrom says science was on the side of the U.S., which showed no evidence of the virus in U.S. ground beef. The reopening comes after months of work by U.S. officials, and USMEF adds now there is work to be done to regain market share. Well, U.S. soybean farmers are working to expand export markets, not just for soybeans, but soybean meal. It's due to the expansion of the soy processing industry. A trade team from the Southeast Asia toured farms in northwestern Corn Belt recently to check out this year's soybean crop, as well as build relationships. The group represented the Philippine livestock and feed industry. Buyers toured farms in North Dakota through Nebraska to see how farmers raise soybeans and their sustainability practices. They told us they prefer to buy soybeans and meal from states in the northwestern belt due to the high nutritional value.
Based on the feedback of my nutritionist, they have the highest quality of amino acid, particularly the soybean meal that we get from the U.S., particularly in the PNW.
We do a lot of research on different ways to feed it to different livestock that traditionally might not eat meal, and but we're also working on getting export markets established to use as much meal as we can out of the area.
The Philippines is a top U.S. meal customer, and they saw firsthand the quality of the soy product they're buying and say they are pleased to find a better crop than last year. They say the drop in soybean prices is attractive, but quality trumps all in the global market. Well, you've probably heard of 45Z, which is a tax credit for the domestic production of clean transportation fuels. It takes effect at the start of 2025. And we're still waiting on a lot of answers. What's taking so long? Well, that is our Chip's Corner right after the break.
Chip's Corner on U.S. Farm Report is brought to you by Research. Maximize your valuable fertilizer investment with Research, an exclusive low-dust humic granule from Helena.
Time now for Chip's Corner. Chip, the state of Kansas will soon be a big producer of sustainable aviation fuel. They will soon break ground for a new Sapphire plant in Liberal, Kansas, which will ship ethanol to Georgia's sustainable aviation fuel plant that's already in operation today. We've talked about that plant. The goal is for that plant in Georgia to ultimately pump out 10 million gallons of SAF a year. A lot of excitement, but also some uncertainty, Chip, because we still don't have answers about 45Z.
Yeah, Tyne, there's no question. We are still looking for lots of answers on 45Z and exactly what it might mean for us going forward. It's important to producers there in Kansas. It's important to producers across the country. As a matter of fact, when I talk to producers right now, one of the things I've been asking them is what's more important to you, getting a farm bill passed before the end of the year or getting details of the 45Z and what production practices are going to qualify and how we are going to lower the carbon intensity. Most producers right now are saying, listen, it's 45Z. That's exactly where we need to be. Now, when it comes to the rules and the regulations around 45Z, we're looking at the Treasury Department, at the IRS, and saying, you've got to give us the details of it. And I asked U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley about some of those details, and he's got some very specific points that he wants to make very clear to the Treasury Department when they're putting together those details.
There's a couple things I think that we're trying to get the Treasury Department to take into consideration. We shouldn't be subsidizing virgin palm oil like we do used cooking oil. And if the two are mixed together, we ought to be able to make sure none of it gets the credit. And I think it's wrong to be subsidizing imports into the United States to compete against their own soybeans. So I'd like to have 45Z just apply to our domestic production.
So as you can see, there are some real issues that we are going through on getting the details of the 45Z tax credits and exactly who is going to be eligible for those tax credits. And Senator Grassley obviously doesn't want imported used cooking oil or imported ethanol qualifying for U.S. tax credits that are designed to provide incentive for domestic production of the sustainable aviation fuel and some of the other next generation biofuels that are coming to the market. So if Senator Grassley gets his way, we're going to get some real clarity on what products, what feedstocks are going to qualify for these next gen biofuel credits.
Very good points. Thanks, Chip. Well, when we come back, one of the biggest challenges for landowners, farmers, and ranchers here is water. How Kansas State is working to stay ahead of the game. That's next. Kansas State is tackling some major problems, and we're talking issues off the field. Water challenges are a problem statewide. They may look different from west to east, but as we tell you this weekend, the university is taking the lead to tackle water resource challenges in more impactful ways. Protecting the state's most precious resource is a top priority here in Kansas.
More than 40% of the state's economic driver is agriculture, and so being able to find ways we're able to responsibly use our water resources in food and ag production is critically important.
Spanning more than 82,000 square miles wide, Kansas is the 15th largest state by area, and the water needs and availability are drastically different from east to west.
In Kansas, it's particularly important because in western Kansas, the Ogallala High Plains is severely depleted. So we know if we don't change our actions in the next 50 years, it'll be 70% depleted. Eastern Kansas, with our surface water, we don't change our actions, we lose more than 40% of our storage capacity to sedimentation.
Susan Metzger is the director of the Kansas Water Institute. She says ensuring Kansas has a reliable water supply spawned a new idea, creating a statewide initiative led by Kansas State University.
The Kansas Water Institute was officially launched as a university-level institute at K-State last fall with the launch of our Next Gen strategic plan. And the goal of the Water Institute is to bring together all of our talented faculty and staff who do work in water resources, whether that's research, teaching, or extension and engagement, so that we can help tackle the state's water resource priorities.
The work here is defined by the state's water plan with 5 guiding principles, which include addressing the declines of the Ogallala High Plains aquifer, looking at sedimentation in reservoirs, water quality across the state, the ability to be resilient to extreme events like drought and flood, as well as making sure all of Kansas residents have a strong understanding of the water resources.
It basically identifies the highest priorities related to water resources in the state, and then also how are we going to direct all of our resources, whether that's state funding or federal funding or people power, to address those challenges.
In less than a year, the Kansas Water Institute has been able to secure state appropriation to tackle some heavy-hitting projects while also engaging students. But their work here is far from finished.
Right now is something called the Testing Ag Performance Solution, or TAPS program. So this is a program that was started in the University of Nebraska and now has spread to several states. But basically it takes farm management and gamifies it. So we have a plot in Colby, Kansas, where 34 teams that are comprised of producers and industry partners since March have been making week-by-week management decisions that we replicate in a cornfield for them.
Starting with their seed selection and placement to other planting decisions like dates and row spacing, as well as how often they are irrigating. It's all captured and documented.
They tell us every week what they want to do, including their crop insurance and their marketing. We replicate it in the field, and here pretty soon we're going to harvest that crop and be able to award prizes for the most profitable with the least amount of inputs. So you can imagine just the wealth of data that comes out of a program like that, and then the engagement that you have people when you get to gamify and reduce some risk of farm management decisions.
With all that data and information, the team then taps into resources of researchers on campus.
The TAPS program is helpful for advancing technology adoption, different approaches of water management. So if you're going to make a management decision in your own operation, there's a lot of risk that comes along with that, either the investment that you have to make in technology or being able to look ahead a few years and make some changes in your planting decisions. But if you can try those management decisions without that risk through the TAPS program, then you can feel more confident making the decision changes in your larger operation.
All of this research will then be harvested to help create a plan to preserve water across Kansas, which will no doubt be a challenge. But it will also ensure farming and raising livestock here will continue to be the bedrock of Kansas for future generations.
There's also real beauty in that too. So if we're able to identify research solutions, management solutions, policy solutions that work for the diversity of water resources in Kansas, you can just imagine how replicable it could be throughout the nation and world.
When we come back, looking back while moving forward. It was a major milestone for one cattle-focused event this week, and we're here to experience it all. College Roadshow this weekend.
Register now for the Milk Business Conference, December 10th and 11th in Vegas, for a chance to win tickets to the National Finals Rodeo while in town.
This week marked a major milestone here at K-State. The 25th anniversary of the Beef Stocker Field Day happened on Thursday. And what a ride the cattle industry has been on the past 25 years. But this year, the Stocker Field Day was able to look back while also looking forward.
There's been a plethora of research conducted, and we know the impacts of growth implants. We know the positive outcomes with the use of exogenous growth technologies. Limit feeding. We've done a lot of program and limit feeding, and we know through research conducted here at the K-State Beef Stocker Unit that we can reduce water input, and we can also improve feed efficiency by upwards of 30% and reduce manure output by upwards of 45%.
Dale Blasi is the Extension Beef Specialist here at K-State and has more than 300 producers gathered for the Stocker Field Day. He says there was a lot of discussion on what's going to change the game in the decades to come.
The reliance on roughages in dry lot diets and growing diets, we're so susceptible to drought throughout the country, and having a high reliance on forages truly is not sustainable, especially when considering the fact that the forage itself is marginally digestible, and as a consequence there's an increase in production of manure, which is another issue that producers need to deal with in terms of removing it from the operation and finding a safe, environmentally sustainable way to use it into its soil.
Well, there's a lot going on this weekend because it's also Kansas State University's Celebrate Agriculture Weekend, an entire weekend to put the spotlight on agriculture by featuring activities for high school students, children, alumni, and friends.
We are on the front end of a very, very exciting next couple of years at least. We've got new building projects that are really creating a lot of excitement.
It's all part of the Agriculture Innovation Initiative, which includes multiple new buildings. And Minton says the investments are designed to leverage K-State's core areas of strength in new and exciting ways for food, agriculture, and beyond.
The Global Center for Grain and Food Innovation, 3 agronomy buildings, agronomy research buildings are 2 parts of that, an agronomy innovation center, and then I mentioned the Bilbrey Event Center. So those are the new spaces. We're having significant renovations to Call and Weber Hall. That's where our animal science, food science faculty are housed. And then this new building, the Global Center for Grain and Food Innovation, will be built actually between those, and there'll be physical connections so that that 3-building complex will be connected. Architects talk about trying to design buildings and spaces like that to create collisions of ideas, to generate more innovation and more multidisciplinary discussions.
What a weekend it'll be. Well, that does it for U.S. Farm Report this weekend from here at Kansas State University. Make sure to join us next weekend. We're off to World Dairy Expo in Madison, Wisconsin. And if you have plans to attend World Dairy Expo next week, make sure to join us for our live taping that happens at noon on Wednesday. But you can also catch the entire show next weekend as we work to build on our tradition. Have a great weekend, everyone.
U.S. Farm Report is produced and distributed by Farm Journal Broadcast.